Okay, so hello everybody. We are here again for another conference on the Colóquio de Estudos Vikings e Escandinavos. For the conference, we have Professor Kevin Smith. I'm going to present Professor Kevin Smith in English and then in Portuguese, so we have a bit of an idea of the professor that we are dealing here. So, Professor Kevin Smith. Um, Kevin Smith is an archaeologist specializing in the study of North Atlantic societies affiliated with the Smithsonian Institution. Much of his research has focused on medieval Iceland, where he is particularly interested in the processes that led to the creation of an independent, short lived Icelandic state in the mid 13th century, as well as the earlier role of Icelandic elites in rituals and the formation of pre-Christian mythological ontologies. He has ongoing research projects in North American archaeology, circumpolar archaeology, and the archaeologies of law, fear, and caves. He is a member of the scientific committee of the Scandia Journal of Medieval Norse Studies. Em português, Kevin Smith é arqueólogo especializado no estudo das sociedades no Atlântico Norte, vinculado ao Instituto Smithsoniano. Grande parte da sua investigação centrou-se na Islândia Medieval, onde está especialmente interessado nos processos que levaram à criação de um estado islandês independente e de curta duração em meados do século XIII, e no papel anterior das elites islandesas no ritual e na criação de ontologias mitológicas pré-cristãs. Ele tem projetos de pesquisa em andamento em arqueologia norte-americana, arqueologia circumpolar e arqueologias jurídicas do medo e das cavernas. Professor Smith é parte do comitê científico do Scandia Journal of Medieval Norse Studies. Professor Kevin, we'll have your conference now, okay. And then we go to a round of questions. Maybe we go one question and then you answer and another question. That's all right for you?
Sounds wonderful. Thank you, Pablo.
On behalf of the entire NEV, we thank you for your presence and your conference. So the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Pablo. Thank you for that nice introduction. I have to say, it sounds so much better in Portuguese than in English. And I am really proud and thankful to be here with all of you today. Before I begin, I would like to thank Johnny Langer and Luciana de Campos for organizing this conference through Neve and inviting me to speak to you today. And of course, Pablo Miranda for being my host today, and also the technology team members I've met with, Guilherme Gallego, Andre Oliveira, and Lorenzo Sterzi. I hope I've gotten your names even close to right, who have all helpfully been getting me this talk out to you as seamlessly and as graciously as they've helped me through the process of working with StreamYard. I'm going to try to share my screen now, and Pablo, maybe you can let me know if it is being seen. Do we have the first slide up? All right.
Yes, perfect. It's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So I assume, but probably shouldn't assume, that most of the people who are tuned in and who are watching this because of the reasons they came here have a pretty good idea of the Viking Age, the background, where places like Iceland are. But as I say, there's never a bad question and never a reason not to at least provide some background. So in this slide, you can see the general process of the migration and movement of people from mainland Scandinavia and the British Isles across the North Atlantic to Iceland, which they found, according to their own medieval sources, written a few hundred years after the events described, primarily in the late 12th and 13th century. The Icelandic narrative was that settlers who had begun to settle in the Northern Isles of Britain, in Shetland, Orkney, and such, were blown off course or sailed farther to the west, depending on which source you read, to the Faroe Islands, which they reached about 800 AD. and then while trying to go there were blown offshore or began to investigate farther to the west and reached Iceland sometime around 860 AD. That led to a very quick expansion of the human population of settlers to Iceland beginning around 870. That's the literary narrative, and it seems to follow the archaeological narrative remarkably well. We have only one or two sites on Iceland that appear to date before about 880 AD, before about 871 AD, where those are a couple of sites in the southwestern part of the Iceland that have thin archaeological remains beneath a two-colored volcanic ash layer called the landnám or settlement ash layer, which can be dated to 877 plus or minus 1 AD. And that precision is based on its presence as well in the Greenland ice sheets, where it can be dated by counting back annual layers. In the late 9th century AD, when the Viking colonists discovered Iceland, one thing they could not have known would be that they were colonizing one of the world's most volcanically active islands. For them, Iceland, a previously unknown and unoccupied land with forests, freshwater lakes and rivers, saltwater bays teeming with marine mammals, and meadows to feed their livestock, it presented untold opportunities. And what they came there for was really this opportunity to set up really new society based on agricultural productivity. Now, genetic, isotopic, and material culture analyses confirm that these settlers came primarily from continental Scandinavia and the British Isles, which are two of Europe's least tectonically active regions. And what they couldn't have known was that the new land they had found and were settling was one of the most tectonically active places on Earth, with 30 separate active volcanic systems, represented here by the red triangles, stretching along the borders of the present and past locations of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which passes diagonally through the island and spreads the eastern half towards Europe and the western half towards North America. Technically, the west side of Iceland is North America, and the east side of Iceland, geologically, is Europe. Now, shortly before Iceland settlers arrived, as I mentioned, there were two nearly simultaneous eruptions in southern Iceland that blanketed much of the island with a distinctive bicolored ash deposit that's now dated to 877 plus or minus 1. This so-called landnám tefra, landnám meaning land taking or the settlement, lays just beneath the earliest cultural deposits at almost all sites across Iceland and serves as a clear chronostratigraphic marker for the island's first Norse colonization. In western Iceland, in the Borgarfjörður district, where I've worked since 1987, here in the western part, the landnám tefra lies directly beneath the walls of the earliest structures at sites like Gilsbakki, Hals, and Reykholt, showing that farms and iron production sites had expanded more than 50 kilometers from the coast into the wooded interior before 900 AD. But just a few years later, as settlers were establishing farms across the region, the unthinkable happened. A volcano erupted beneath the edge of the massive glacier Langjökull that rises as a white wall across the district's eastern horizon. The eruption, we now know from watching a very similar set of eruptions begin in the last couple of years in southern Iceland, would have been preceded by thousands of earthquakes, increasing in intensity and frequency over the span of weeks or months as lava moved closer to the surface. As the eruption began, water entering fissures from the melting glacier would have sent volcanic ash high into the air, with thunder and lightning that are otherwise unknown in the North Atlantic crashing through the superheated clouds of ash and steam rising on the horizon. And at night, the crater's fiery glow would have painted the sky red. When the glacier melted back enough for the flow of water to ebb, the eruption became effusive, sending rivers of lava out from at least two and probably three craters located, as you see on the map, against the edge of Langjökull, with lava snaking 50 kilometers down into the lowlands, following the area that's enclosed by the red mark here. Looks a bit like an elephant's trunk heading off to the west. We know that the lava boiled away two rivers, changed their courses, and may have covered 5 to 6 newly established farms, whose names were still known in the 12th century when they were recorded in the Book of Settlements, or Landnámabók, but whose locations are unknown today. And the way Landnámabók progresses in cycles around it implies that these farms were probably located near the western end of this volcanic eruption, as you can see there to the far southwest. And in this map, all of the little orange dots are farms that are said to have been settled in that first generation, according to Landnámabók, and or that are known archaeologically to have been identified as having been from those first decades of settlement. As the lava progressed, it eventually came to spread over an area of 185 square kilometers, which is, for those who are in the United States, that's 71.5 square miles, covering all of that land of once fertile upland meadows, grazing lands, forests, and occupied land in the lowlands beneath a 25 to 40 meter deep wasteland of black smoking lava, which is today called the Hálmshraun. Immediately beneath the base of that lava field is a layer of burnt forest vegetation that rests on that same Landnám tephra, confirming that this eruption began no more than a decade or two after 877, and would have been the first major volcanic eruption that Northern Europeans had experienced directly in their homelands since the late Pleistocene Lachersee eruption in northern Germany 13,000 years ago. During the eruption, subterranean channels carried lava beneath the lava field surface, and when the lava flow changed direction or intensity, some of these emptied, forming massive caves beneath the surface. Today, more than 20 of these have been located, and 10 are known to contain archaeological sites of some nature. I've investigated 2 of them with my colleague Guðmundur Ólafsson, including the largest, Surtshellir, and he's looked at one of the others. Surtshellir is one of the largest of these caves, and perhaps the best known since the 17th century. It is 1.6 kilometers long and sits in the middle of the lava field. You can see here a view towards the entrance of the cave, and you can see that in front of it there is a sort of a depressed, almost amphitheater-like flat space where the roof of the cave during the eruption, or at the very end of it, subsided, leaving this rather circular area in which tourists have recently built these piles of stones. The important thing to think about is, how did people find this cave? While the lava flow was going on, it would have been impossible to see, and until this front area subsided, it would have been impossible. And in this view, where we're looking towards the mouth from the edge of that subsided area in front of it, it's possible to see the cave's mouth, or at least the very top of it. But from any other part of the lava field, it's impossible to see, because this cave doesn't exist in a cliff on the side. It actually opens down vertically down into the lava field itself. The most likely reason that this was able to be seen and identified right after the eruption ended is that the interior of lava caves can retain heats of up to 900 degrees Celsius for years after the eruption ends. The molten basalt that is held underneath the crust as it begins to stabilize, can hold these temperatures, and quite reasonably, there's not a lot of evidence or data on how long it takes for a 185 square kilometer lava field to cool down. But it appears to be at least in the range of 5 to 10 years, if not decades, to cool down to a point where humans could enter into it. At the same time, that amount of heat stored inside means that any water, any snow, any rain percolating through the surface or coming in through the mouth of the cave would have boiled and turned into steam. So in the winter in particular, it would have appeared as though there was vapor, steam, or smoke coming out of the mouth of the cave. And because of the ways in which the winds work, it's possible, in fact likely, that it could well have looked like breath coming out of the cave, like something breathing down inside there and exhaling its warm breath into the surface. At the very least, the cave seems to have been found and located fairly quickly. Now, the presence of archaeological remains inside the cave has been known at least since the 1750s, when 2 Icelandic naturalists named Egert Ólafsson and Bjarni Pálsson in 1753, while they were going around Iceland and describing its geological factors, its ethnographic characteristics, its resources, they did a long description of Surtshellir as one of these places that was considered to be really important from a natural historic perspective. And they noted that far back into the cave, there were the remains of a structure and a massive pile of bones, which at the time they interpreted on the basis of folklore that was current at the time as having been the location where a group of outlaws had lived at some point in the past. And the folktale about the outlaws really talks about these being 18 young priests who were being trained in the Middle Ages at the Episcopal See, the Cathedral of Holar in the north of Iceland, who had become evil for various reasons and who came in and lived in the cave, abducted women, raped them, had children with them, murdered the children, robbed the locals until they were eventually rousted. So it was a place that was considered quite a matter of fear, but there were also other earlier stories, other folk tales about it that explained the name and why it had to do with an individual or a being called Surtur, which we'll get to in a bit. I want to just give you a sense why we went there. It's a fascinating place, but our reason for going really had more to do with chance. In 2000, I was excavating a Viking Age iron production site in the west of Iceland at a place called Hals. And we were having our dinners at night with the archaeological crew from the National Museum of Iceland at a village nearby called Reykholt. And one night while we were having dinner there, and there were some American tourists who had arrived, they heard my accent and came over to talk to me and asked what we were doing. And when we talked to them about that we were doing archaeological work, they said, "Well, you're doing it much too slowly. You know, it's much more interesting. They've just built a new road up into the interior. We went to this cave called Surtshellir, and by gosh, we came back with bags of bones that we pulled out of the cave to take home as souvenirs." And I had heard of Surtshellir before. I'd been to the outside of it once before, and I thought this was an alarming prospect. And you can see here a group of tourists inside the cave, and to the left of them, a yellow deposit, which is all that remained at that point of a layer of bones that we can tell went up as high as the yellow line on the left side of the cave, where there's organic staining from bones decaying against the wall of the cave, and also fragments of bone that are actually stuck to the wall of the cave that high. And the size of the bone pile and the depth of it, 80 centimeters deep at that point that you see with the yellow line, matches exactly with what Egert Olafsson and Bjarni Pálsson had talked about in 1753 when they visited it. And even then, in their narrative, they talked about rummaging through the bone pile, taking parts of it away, throwing parts of it away. And it appears as you look for 250 years through the records of geologists, explorers, tourists, and others who've come in, this bone pile has been picked apart and picked apart and picked apart for years. In 2000, after we heard that tourists were going in and taking more bones out of it, or taking bones out of it, I talked to my colleague, Guðmundur Ólafsson from the National Museum of Iceland, and asked what was known about the cave. He said, well, yeah, there's something known there, but it's never been mapped. It's never been really explored. It's not a protected site. And I said, well, why don't we go up and take a look at it? I put some money from the grant I had towards it. And just in October 2001, he and I and Agnes Friðriksdóttir, who was also at the National Museum of Iceland at the time, went up and had just a very short 1.5-day visit to the cave. We put a small excavation unit across the bottom of what was left of the bone pile to get a sense of what was there. We mapped the standing ruins of the structure behind, which is behind these people in this slide. And we ran a couple of radiocarbon dates because it was really unknown what the date of this site was. And the radiocarbon dates we got back showed that it was from very early in the 10th century, that this was a Viking Age site that was being actively picked apart by tourists. We wrote that first season up in a couple of papers in which we followed the local folklore, in part because the local landowners were insistent upon that, in part because it provided some good guidance, we thought at the time, that this had potentially been a site where outlaws had lived in the Viking Age. And even though that seemed like it fit with a local narrative, and folklore is something that you do want to at least take into consideration, there were quite a number of aspects of what should be there for a group of people trying to live more than a few days, 250 meters back into the total darkness of a cave, that we simply weren't seeing. Things that would have been necessary for living, the kinds of evidence of intense lighting that would have been required to be able to simply move around in the cave at any point in the middle of the night for whatever reason. In total darkness, it is total darkness. You can't see anything, and it's very easy to fall over the edge of a cliff, which there are in this cave, or to whack your head against something. To be hurt or killed in total darkness is very easy. And so having light all of the time, having places, frankly, where you could go to the bathroom in the middle of the night or during the day. You don't want to have to run 250 meters through a cave to get to the outside. And the preservation in the cave is good enough that had there been a place where people were able to do what was necessary, or where their meals had been left behind, we would have seen it. So it seemed unlikely that this was really very good. And as you can see at the bottom of this slide, it does talk about 18 outlaws. This is from Landnámabók around 1200 AD, writing back in the 10th century. 18 cave dwellers, 18 people called cave dwellers, were killed at a place called Hellisfitjar, which is in the lava field. But as I've said, there are at least 20 caves there, and it doesn't mention Surtshellir by name. Although, as we'll see, Surtshellir was referred to by name in the same book, Landnámabók, with a very different reason. And as we looked a little farther into the folklore that talked about outlaws, certainly, as I say, the contemporary stories had more to do with a pre-Reformation 15th, 16th century story about these young Catholic priests who had occupied the cave. So that's where we were in 2001. And about 9 years passed. There were other projects to be done. It was still in the back of my mind that this didn't seem very much like a place where outlaws would have lived. And if they had lived in the cave, why not live closer to the mouth in places that we could also see where there was no evidence of activity there? In 2010, though, we learned that the site was being visited by an increasing number of tourists as Iceland's economy rebuilt itself on tourism after the economic crash of 2008, 2009. And 2 years later, with funding from the United States National Science Foundation and support from Minjastofnun, the Icelandic Heritage Agency, we returned to the site to re-examine it and determine, among other things, whether tourism was impacting it, and also whether we could see evidence that we might have missed the first time, that people had been, in fact, living in the cave with all of the things that we would expect to see from long-term occupation. Unfortunately, though, we found to our surprise, as you can see in the left-hand side of the slide, that tourists were walking through the cave. They were disturbing this very thin layer of gray ash and crushed basalt that you can see under and around the feet of these German tourists walking through the cave. They were mixing it up, and also that some of these were, and that there were within that deposit, Viking age glass beads, some of which, as you can see on the upper right and lower right, were in the footprints of tourists and had been crushed by them. We realized that all it would take was a single sharp-eyed tourist to spot one of those beads, and a group of them could have stripped this thin deposit, potentially with an unknown number of Viking age artifacts in it, could be stripped of all of its artifacts within a few hours, and any patterning that was present in it destroyed. And since 1755, this thin layer of sandy material on the floor had been known, but had been talked about as something which was completely sterile. In fact, in 1750s, Eggert Olufsen and Bjarni Pálsson had hypothesized that it had been laid down on the floor of the structure to create a smooth bed for people to sleep on. And it had been looked at and no artifacts were found. So this was the first evidence we had that it was not actually sterile, that there were actually significant artifacts in it and that they were being actively destroyed. Now, over the intervening years, we had also reviewed all of the written sources about Surtsettler from the medieval to the modern period. And we realized that Surtsettler's name first appears, in fact, in that 12th to 13th century Icelandic Book of Settlements, or Landnámabók, which records stories about the settlers of more than 400 farms across Iceland that were established between 880 and 930 AD. In Landnámabók, in just a few sentences, as it shows on the left-hand side of this slide, it tells the story of a man called Thorvaldur Hollowthroat Thordarson, who was the son of a chieftain from northern Iceland called Thord of Hofdi, both of whom claimed descent ultimately from the god Odin through Ragnar Lothbrok. And it says that Thorvald Hollowthroat, which probably means he's a chanter, a person who could sing or who could chant poetry in a metric and lyric form, poetry being a gift of the god Odin, and not something which was just meant to pass the time, but which was usually considered efficacious, being able to cause things to happen, if said in the right way. So, according to the Book of Settlements, Thorvaldur Hollowthroat Thordarson, who is the son of a chieftain from northern Iceland, travels 150 kilometers through the interior of Iceland to chant a magically efficacious poem into the mouth of the cave that is inhabited by the giant who dwelled within it. And the cave is called, literally, the Cave of Surtur. This is important because Surtur's name is linked directly to the beginnings and endings of all things in Norse mythology. And both Thorvaldur's elite status, his name Hollowthroat, his action at the cave, and the being to whom his poem was supposedly directed, all suggested that Surtsettler might have been instead a site of supernatural importance in the Viking Age and of ritual actions. But we had no evidence of that archaeologically yet. To understand why it would be significant, it's necessary to take a brief diversion into what we know of Norse mythology from a medieval Icelandic perspective and what it says about this being Surtur, who is supposed to have lived in the cave. Most of what we know about Norse mythology and religion across Scandinavia actually comes from two sources that were written or compiled in 13th century Iceland. The poetic Edda, whose authors and compilers are unknown, but it appears to have been put together in the 13th century with poetry that is thought to be much earlier, potentially going back to the 8th, 9th, 10th century. The other, the prose Edda, was written by Snorri Sturluson, a chieftain, one of the wealthiest men in Iceland, who unified a third of Iceland under his control in the early 13th century and lived here at the place on the left called Reykholt, which is only about 35 kilometers away from Surtsettler. In fact, Snorri owned the land that Surtsettler is in from 1210 onwards, after he had unified his control over this entire district. And in 1236, his son Oreikja was mutilated, castrated, and blinded, and left to die inside Surtsettler. Snorri compiled most of the stories that we know of the gods into narrative form. And according to both the prose Edda and the poetic Edda, the beginning of time began with two worlds, one to the north of cold, ice, and venom called Niflheim, and one to the south that was burning and bright and full of flame called Muspelheim. The heat from Muspell melted the glaciers, melted the ice of Niflheim, and in the space between them developed a place called Ginnungagap, in which everything that we know and all of the 9 worlds of Norse mythology existed. Muspelheim at the south, in other words, its heat, created the essence of what was necessary to create life. And the guardian of Muspelheim, and the first being in existence, according to Norse mythology, was Surtur, who was as it says, the first world to exist was Muspelheim in the southern hemisphere. It's light and hot, and that region flames and burns. The one who sits there at the land's end to guard it is called Surt. He has a flaming sword, and at the end of the world, he will come and harry and will vanquish all the gods and burn the whole world with fire. So Surtur, who according to Landnámabók, and who is said to have owned this cave, this to be his place, would have been in Norse mythology, at least as it was known in Iceland, the first being to exist, that being which brings existence into creation through the heat of his realm, and to bring with it all of the gods. Now, to summarize just really quickly, most of you probably know, as Ginnungagap begins to develop, as the fire melts the ice, the whole series of beings come into existence that include initially giants. From the giants are born another group of beings who we know as the gods. There are at least two families of them, the Aesir and the Vanir. And according to this sort of a structure, it's a very organized system of a pantheon. This is based on Snorri's account, and there is no doubt that Snorri's account has tried from a 13th century perspective to systematize Norse religion in ways that may not have existed on the ground at the time. Ultimately, everything that we know in Norse mythology, the gods, humans, and others, live in a world that will eventually come to an end. And the dead are, for example, gathered by Odin and by Freya at the dead warriors at the end of every battle and brought up to Valhalla and to Freya's realm to learn to fight, to get better, to kill each other, to fight again the next day, to prepare for the battle at the end of time that will bring the world to an end, called Ragnarok. And in Snorri Sturluson's Gylfaginning, or one of his pieces within the Prose Edda, he describes the process of Ragnarok. There will be 3 winters in sequence with battles throughout the world, followed by 3 years in sequence of no summer with continual winters of frost, snow, and wind. Then the wolf will swallow the sun, another wolf will swallow the moon, the stars will fall from the sky. The earth will then shake so much that mountains will fall, and everything that binds chaos, the beings of chaos, will break. This means that a being called the Fenris wolf will become free. The Midgard serpent that encircles the world and holds the oceans in place will come ashore with the oceans coming up on land. A ship called Naglfar, made from the fingernails of the dead, will come loose from its moorings and will be steered by a giant called Hrym and will be filled with frost giants. And together, all of these will ravage the world. And then the sky will open, and from it will come the sons of Muspel, the fire giants, led by Surtur, all surrounded by fire. All of these beings will converge on a plain called Vigridr, where they'll be met by all of the gods, all of the dead, and with Loki, who arrives with all of the dead who were not warriors, who were not killed in battle, who are released from hell. And in the battle that follows, all of the gods are killed. And it particularly says that Tyr will be killed by the hellhound Garm. Thor will then be killed by the Midgard serpent. Odin will be killed by the Fenris wolf. Heimdall will be killed by Loki. And eventually the last of the gods to die will be Freyr, the god of agricultural fertility, peace and prosperity, who will be killed by Surtur himself, this being who represents fire and volcanic destruction. And after Freyr finally falls, Surtur will fling fire over the earth and will burn up the whole world. So the being Surtur, for whom the cave is named, and to whom Thorvaldr Holbarki is said to have sung a poem of a magical poem, a deeply significant poem, into the mouth of the cave, is not only the being who would bring the world into existence, but the being who would bring the world to an end in fire and flame. And when you think about the fact that what the Icelandic people had just witnessed was their first volcanic eruption, one that covered 185 square kilometers, and that we now know lasted for at least 20 and probably 30 years, possibly in different pulses with periods of quiet, but at least for that long. This was an existential crisis of world-shaking order, something that would never have been expected in any aspect of the experiences, life experiences, that the Norse or other Northern Europeans would have had. In 1905, a female scholar from the University of Cambridge, who later taught at Oxford, named Bertha Philpotts, wrote a piece about Surtur, which was really incisive and has largely been forgotten. She noted, though, that the only place on Earth that is linked to Surtur by name is Surtshellir. And she argued that its presence in a lava field suggested that Surtur was probably believed to be responsible for volcanic eruptions. But apparently she never visited the cave. She also argued that the end of the world that's attributed to him in the Icelandic sources might not have been based on earlier Scandinavian beliefs brought to Iceland, but was most likely based on the Icelandic experience, implying that what we think of as a uniform vision of Ragnarok and of Norse mythology is probably not something ancient and possibly not even uniform across Scandinavia. Well, she didn't go to Surtsettler, but we did, so let's go into the cave. As I mentioned, you arrive at the cave, you come to this amphitheater-like space, big flat space in front of the mouth of the cave, which opens in front of you and drops down about 15 meters, 45 feet from this space, down to the floor of the cave. And inside the cave, it looks like this. This is not a mistake. This is what total darkness looks like. Once you get more than about 70 meters into the cave, past the area where light can penetrate from the outside, you are in total darkness. There is no way to see anything. There is no way to be able to, you can spend hours trying to get your eyes to adjust. There is no way. It is complete darkness. The cave is massive. It's about 1.6 kilometers long, and here you can see a representational map, a little bit out of scale. This was done by a caving society back in the 1980s. We know from mapping it, from measuring things now, some of the distances are a little bit wrong. But this is giving you a sense of, by the shading, where at the northern end, as you can see, the entrance to the cave was. There's an area of twilight that dissipates, and eventually you get into the total darkness of the cave. Where it says a radius of light provided by a torch, that gives you a sense about just how small an area would have been illuminated by a single torch, not an electric torch, by a flaming torch. Surtsettler, as I say, is 1.6 kilometers long. It's part of a larger system, at least 5 kilometers. It is 35 kilometers southwest of the erupting craters that form the Hotmundaroid, and the tunnels are huge, 10 to 13 meters wide, 10 to 15 meters high. And as you can see, about halfway through here, it cuts through, in a darker shade of black, a series of smaller tunnels that are 5.5 meters above the floor of the main tunnel and represent the path of an earlier cave through which Surtsettler's main tunnel was cut. Now, there are 4 massive areas where the roof has collapsed in post-medieval time, and a 5th one, which is forming right at the present day. So if we illuminate the cave, we begin to see that this is what's inside the cave. It is actually a quite massive archaeological site, which is vast, with archaeological features that are spread out over a distance of more than 100 meters along the main tunnel, and 120 meters down 2 side galleries. They're located, as I say, 5.5 meters above the main tunnel. So the first thing that we see about 120 meters into the cave is a massive dry stone wall, 13 meters long, originally standing 4.5 meters high, with no evidence of a doorway. About 100 meters farther in, at a crossing point, there are these 2 caves called Vigishellir and Beinahellir, which are 5.5 meters above. So you come through here in the darkness. You have to know when you get to this point that you have to climb 5.5 meters vertically up the side of the cave into these side passages. And in them are the remains of 7, actually, ultimately 7 piles of bone and constructed archaeological features. So the site actually spans, at the very least, from that massive dry stone wall, 100 meters into the interior, and then 120 meters across the length of these side tunnels. And there's a Viking age structure deep at the end of one with a massive bone pile, which makes 7, and nothing in the interior. To give you a sense of the scale of the cave, here are some images that show it today. This is where we're looking through one of these areas where the ceiling has collapsed. We know this area was just beginning to collapse from a description in the 1650s, 1660s. So it's post-medieval. And it's about the size of a soccer field, of a football field. And as you can see from the scale of the people standing on top of the cave in the upper right-hand area, these dwarf any humans coming into them. And inside you can see. Now, in the lower right, you can see 2 images looking across the main tunnel On the one right in the lower left, we're looking from inside Vigishellir, which is the one that we'll be talking about most today, where there's a Viking Age structure across the main tunnel to another side gallery called Banehellir. And at the very lower right, we're looking from that entrance across the mouth into the cave where the Viking Age structure and other features are developed. As I said, the very first thing that you see coming into the cave is this dry stone wall, which, as I said, we can see 2.5 meters of it that are visible above the collapsed debris from the collapse of the ceiling. And knowing where the floor is down below and what we could see by probing down through, we know that the top of it was originally 4.5 or 5 meters above the floor. It's 10 to 13 meters long, depending on how you look at the collapse. It's made of dry stone. The individual blocks are massive, some of them up to 4,500 kilograms. We estimate there's about 100,000 kilograms of stone that were moved here by hand in the darkness to create this wall, which has no entrance, no exit. It is clearly meant either to block something from coming out or to keep people from going in. We can't date it directly, but the construction style for it, the way it's built with the alternating blocks that have little sharp stalactites and others, matches what we see farther into the cave in the structure I'll show you in a few minutes. And we believe this is Viking Age. We also know that this had to be there to be known as late as 1236, because when Snorri Sturluson's son Ulrike was taken into the cave to be mutilated, it says that they took him in and laid him on top of the wall inside Vigishellir, and then cut out one of his eyes, took off one of his testicles, left him to die in the darkness, and the people who took him got out of there as quickly as possible. Clearly, they did not think this was a good place to be. Moving farther back into the cave, we again get to these two areas that I've mentioned here before, the side walls, the side areas that the side caves, Banehellir to the right, with the 4 yellow dots identifying bone piles in that cave, 2 bone piles in the main tunnel just below that, and then to the right, the area called Vigishellir, which, when we look at it more closely, includes a structure seen there by that ovalish structure, and a whole lot of artifacts represented here by the red dots. And this is where we're going to move to next. This is the structure that sits inside Banehellir, or inside Vigishellir, and it is 7.5 meters long, 3.5 meters wide at the central points, 1.5 meters wide at the gables. One gable is put directly into against the wall of the cave, and you can see that strange smudged funnel going up there. We originally thought that might be evidence of where fires were made in the Viking Age. It turns out that's from tourists again. Every time we go there, people have brought in wood to burn in that space. It's unfortunate. And to the left of it, to the left of the case of the structure, you can see the remnants of the bone pile, and again the dark staining on the wall showing where it was. We know that this is as high as the structure ever was. The walls are about 80 centimeters high in places where they've not been impacted by blocks of stone falling from the roof of the cave. They are well built. They are finished on the top. So this was not meant to be a house with a roof on it, because what do you need a roof for inside a cave? This is an enclosure which is meant to be a boat-shaped feature, which sits, as I say, about 250, 270 meters from the entrance in total darkness, walking through the cave, then knowing you've got to get 5.5 meters up the side of the cave, 30 meters farther back into this side channel, and you arrive at this. It is well organized. Here is a map of the cave, as we've done from mapping and surveying it over the years. And to give you a sense of its structure, you can see the boat-shaped or house-shaped structure of the site right there, the bone pile in yellow to above it. There are 3 niches placed symmetrically at the end, and one at the end and 2 at the other end, at the west end of the site. These are niches which were empty when we arrived there, but clearly were meant to house something, and we don't know what. Unfortunately, that's it, but they're very carefully constructed. There are 2 entrances, one leading in the north, coming in from the entrance, So to the north would be to get out of the cave, the other one going into the cave. But there's no evidence of any Viking Age activity except for those white patches where ash was thrown, burned bone ash was thrown into the cave. There's no evidence that humans or people or in the Viking Age ever went through into the deeper parts of the cave, or if they did, they left no evidence there. There's a thin prepared floor of crushed basalt on the ground. This is that gray thin layer that we thought that we mentioned, which was originally thought to be sand carried in to make a smooth bed for people to sleep on. This has been analyzed through thin section analysis by a good colleague of mine named Sarah Sherwood at the Sewanee University in the southern part of the United States. And it turns out it is instead intentionally manufactured by crushing bits of the veneer, the glassite basalt veneer found on the walls of the cave have been crushed intentionally into small fragments and spread over a part of the interior of the cave, the center of the structure, and the entranceway to it. It is clearly an intentionally prepared pad, if you will, but it's only about 1 centimeter or 2 thick, and yet it's very carefully manufactured. In the center of this zone, there is an area of intense burning, which we know by the burnt bones that are focused in that area, and also from fire-damaged pieces of jasper, which is a flint-like material. The damage that is on the bones shows that the fires that were raised in the central part of the structure burned at temperatures of at least 800 degrees centigrade, possibly as high as 1,000 degrees centigrade. And the damage that's done to the jasper confirms that it's about the same temperature required to get the kind of damage we see on that raw material. Outside, as on the right-hand side, as you would approach this structure, is this bone pile, which, as I say, would have been 2.5, is now 2.5 by 3.5 meters at the bottom. It's full of unburned bones. So while the interior of the structure, the floor is filled with fragments of completely cremated bones, the bone pile beside it is full of unburned, crushed, fragmented, and completely destroyed bones. It has been originally 0.8 of a meter high, and it's now been robbed to a very, very small layer left. And then to the left of the entrance, as you would arrive into this structure, there's evidence that, again, my colleague Sarah Sherwood and one of her colleagues, who's a paleoethnobotanist, looked at the samples, looked at the thin sections from this area, and it's clear that this is an area where wood was piled and stored, presumably to create the fires inside, as well as forms of a type of mushroom that was used in the Viking Age when it was dried to create tinder to be able to start fires. And this is an interesting thing. It implies that they were stockpiling wood and tinder here to start fires in the interior. And if you think about it, if you had to arrive to the structure with torches, why would you need to restart fires again? That's an interesting point here, and we'll see lots of evidence of that. It may imply that the fire that you brought from the outside had to be extinguished before you began what you were going to do in the structure, and that the new fires had to be started here from the material that was provided for the future. In 2013, when we came, we divided up that very thin floor layer, as you can see here, into 50 by 50 meter quads. We lit up the interior with work lights. We plotted everything that we could identify in the field to within 1 centimeter on the ground, and then we took all of the sediment that we recovered, everything from that thin floor layer, by each 50 by 50 centimeter quad. We took it back to our research base in Reykholt, and then we screened it all through 1.5 millimeter mesh. And the reason for doing this is that even though it is technically a dry cave, there's no stream that runs through it, it is dark, it is wet, the lighting conditions weren't all that good, and we wanted to make sure we caught every tiny object that could have been in there and every tiny bone fragment so that it could be analyzed down the line. As we began the excavation, you can see here that the floor layer still exists in the back, and once you take it off, you can see the very smooth and furrowed surface of the basalt floor of the cave here, which is actually quite beautiful, and wouldn't have needed much more than a skin to make it comfortable. So again, that thin layer of fragmented basalt wouldn't have been very good as bedding. And once it's excavated, or again, here's looking at it, and you can see then the bone pile, where the bone pile would have been on the left-hand side of the structure. And so I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what we came from there, because that's the first thing you rise. That's the first thing we analyzed. Here is a view down onto the base of the bone pile in 2001. And what you can see there that the thing is pointing to is actually a part of a boar's tusk. So we knew right away that there were pigs here. You can see a lot of other bones here. They're all intentionally very fragmented into tiny, tiny, tiny pieces. We have had two analyses of them done. First, we had Tom McGovern from Hunter College in 2002 analyzed the material, the unburned material from the bone pile. And in 2024, Véronique Maringer from the University of Laval in Quebec analyzed all of the burned material that was found from the floor of the interior. And you can see it's a very similar proportion in each case, with the majority of the bones being from sheep or goat, then cattle, then pigs, then horse. In the bone pile, there were no bird remains found. There were just a few in the interior, and they appear either to be chicken or possibly ptarmigan, which is a wild galliform bird, and only one bone of a wild animal, and that is one piece of seal bone from the interior. And you can see there's a similar number of fragments that were analyzed, and many more were able to be identified to taxon in the work done in 2024. What makes this different from all other Icelandic sites is, with the exception of that one seal bone, and possibly if any of the 5 bird bones are ptarmigan rather than chicken, everything in the site, the vast majority of it, is domestic animals. On the left hand here, you can see an analysis done by Tom McGovern back in 2023. And the shaded gold color there represents, in each of these sites from Iceland and Greenland in the Viking Age, the component of the assemblage that was found there of animals, which is of domesticate animals. And Surtshellir is the only one in which all of the animals are domesticates. And Véronique, when she looked at it this past year and finished her thesis on it, found exactly the same thing. And here she's comparing it to the more diverse range of animals that are found at 2 sites in northeastern Iceland. And there's also a very different age profile here and seasonality profile. So what we're finding is that from sheep, there are sheep of all ages represented there, from the unborn and fetal lambs through full-grown individuals. Pigs, all ages, including fetal pigs, are represented. For cattle, though, there are no neonatal, that is to say, newborn or 6-month-old cattle or calves, which would have been normally on any farm slaughtered in the autumn. All of the young males, except for the ones that were needed to replace the bulls on the farm. There's none of that. So there's a very different thing. Only full-grown individuals in the prime of their life are represented there. And the same with horses. Only full-grown individuals at the prime of their life. Seasonality as well. This is something we're still working on. Both in Tom McGovern's analysis and in Véronique's analysis, there are indications. The only indications we have of seasonality are consistent, that these animals were slaughtered at the end of the winter, at the beginning of the spring, exactly the time that you would not normally slaughter your animals. And it includes animals that had, for example, ewes that were pregnant with their young lambs still in their uteruses, pigs that were not yet born. These are animals that are being killed at the prime of their fertility and killing not only them, but their progeny, something that you wouldn't see in any normal slaughtering routine. It would be suicide to do this on your own farm. This is the opposite of the normal period and process of normal slaughter in Iceland, which normally takes place in the fall. Yet, it is identical to the patterns of bone use and seasonality found in a number of different ritual sites across mainland Scandinavia, and also is consistent with discussions of sacrificial practices in Scandinavia, especially with the sometimes called the Dísablot, or with other late winter, early spring sacrificial practices. In addition to this, the bones in both areas, specifically in the bone pile, were fragmented intentionally with heavy blows of hammers, axes, and large knives or swords. These are bones which were intentionally destroyed and piled in this case. And what Veronique found in looking at the bones that were burned in the interior, doing experimental archaeology, is that inside the structure, especially in this area marked in red here, were evidence of bones that had been burned to completely, but had been in the flesh at the time. In other words, these were not bad meals. These were whole joints of animals, whole legs of animals, whole parts of animals that were burned in the skin until there was nothing left. Again, consistent with what we see in descriptions in the Norse sources and in other places as burnt offerings. And yet, almost 10 times as many bones would have been left to rot and to stink and to just be a massive pile of unburned bones nearby. Veronique was also able to determine from where she was finding the largest concentration of burned bones and the most intensely burnt bones that this area in red that she's marked inside the structure was, in her sense, again, the area where most of the burning had taken place, that this was a central part of the structure and where these offerings were made, where things were eventually burned. And the black circle underneath it, or oval underneath it, is where we had identified, based on the presence of fire-damaged jasper, where that fireplace had been. So again, we get the sense very clear that that the actions in the center of the structure were the most important ones, where things were burnt, and then in those white areas to the lower part of the structure, we see ash being thrown deeper into the cave. We did volumetrically controlled excavation of the base of the bone pile in 2001, and we were able to get a minimum estimate of 550,000 bone fragments would have been in that at the time if it were still to the level we see. And when you break that down a little bit, you ultimately can see, given 207 bones per animal, it may represent at least 134 animals, 85 sheep, goat, in other words, a vast number of animals. And that's an underestimate, we suspect, for that one feature, because it doesn't include any of the bones of the animals that we found on the floor of the structure, nor does it include the bones that were in the other 6 piles of animal bones that stretch 120 meters through the cave there. So we are looking at a place to which, over the space of a period of time, a large number of animals were brought in, killed, sacrificed, probably at the outside of the cave, because you simply cannot drop a cow 15 meters into the bottom and carry it back up 5.5 meters. We suspect that these animals were dispatched outside the cave, that parts of their bodies were brought in, that the bones were broken and brought in, and they were piled inside the cave, and some of them were burned. And the black lines here indicate what would have been done inside the cave, and to the right of that and above it, what would have been done outside. Altogether, it implies, because this is an area which, as we've said, is in the middle of a lava field, that these animals would have had to been brought up from the lowlands. So you could imagine whenever these events took place, it would have involved assembling animals down in the lowlands and bringing them up almost as a procession into the interior up to Surtsettler. We were also able to look at the bones and get radiocarbon dates from them so that we could really pin down when the site was done. We did Bayesian analysis of the radiocarbon dates, of which we had 20 in total, 16 of which relate to the medieval parts of the site. And you can see here, going quickly through it, we were able to identify, based on radiocarbon dates and again on tephra dates from down below, that it looks as though the eruption must have taken place between about 890 and 920 AD. If we leave about a decade for the site to cool down, it matches with the archaeological record, the radiocarbon record, that suggests that activity began inside the cave around 930 AD, continued for 80 to 100 years until about 1020, and then it was closed down and abandoned about 1020 to 1030 AD, which is about 20 years, a generation after Iceland's conversion to Christianity, which is interesting because when Iceland converted to Christianity, the law allowed Icelanders to continue to sacrifice out of sight for about a generation. and this seems to fit with it. The cave appears to have been completely abandoned, with the exception of that torture that was done there in 1236, until the 1670s AD, when we begin to pick up radiocarbon record of explorers, geologists, tourists, and archaeologists after that. To turn quickly to the material culture that was found in there, as I say, we went through and we sorted, we sieved everything through 1.5 millimeter mesh and sorted through it by hand, which is lucky we did, because we found objects like these tiny glass beads down below that are only 2 to 3 millimeters in diameter and 3 to 4 millimeters in length, that have never been seen before in Iceland, in part because nobody was ever foolish enough to do the analysis like that. By doing this, we identified 350 fragments of jasper fire starters of many different colors, all concentrated in the center of the structure, implying that there were many, many fires started inside this, around that central hearth area, and a few in the vestibule right as you come in, implying that occasionally torches were lit or new fires were made there, but that most of the fire-making activity took place inside this structure. Again, raising the question, if you carried fire in, why did you have to make fires here again? It's also significant that the closest source of raw material for making fire starters here is obsidian, which is black. The only color of material that is not found in the cave is obsidian, is black. Everything else is of different bright colors. And if you think about Surtur, whose name means the blackener, the dark one, it seems significant that the nearest source of raw material, which was used in all of the farms in the Viking Age in this part of, within that same valley, are using the black obsidian. It seems to be avoided inside the cave. Again, looking here at the center where the black oval is, this is where the burned pieces are, again indicating the fireplace. And again, here giving you the same idea in a slightly different view. We looked at 240 of the 350 jasper fire starters using X-ray fluorescence, which is a technique that allows you, with this instrument, to be able to get an elemental profile of the material and link it back to sources, geologically obtained sources of raw material, to see where people came from. And basically, if you look at this, the same material, you can see at the upper right, in one of the crevices in the vestibule, you can see a fire starter, 4 pieces of it, from starting one fire, presumably there. These all refit together. And in the lower right is an analysis of looking at a couple of different elements, important elements within these that were identified. And we can begin to break all of the fire starters, in this case, the red ones, down into different groups that represent different locations. And the 3 bigger circles or ovals on the right-hand side are the areas within which the chemical profile exists for 3 really well-known ancient volcanic sources in Western Iceland, which produce jasper. And you can see that group 2 here and group 5, or group 3 here and group 5, match with those sources. To go very quickly through it, to give you a sense, here you can see in the lower right, those 3 at Hestfjallnes and Hvalfjörður. These are areas where we know that jasper was being obtained to start the fires in Surtshellir. And these are 70 to 80 kilometers away. Sources of jasper, sources of opal, sources of obsidian that are closer to Surtshellir weren't used. We also have matches which are a little bit less certain up in the West Fjords and over all the way on the eastern side of Iceland. I'm a little bit concerned about that one, and we obviously need to do a lot more geologic collecting and analysis. But it's indicating that people came to Surtshellir from quite a distance. And if we begin to look at where the sources of those are and how people would have gotten there following the valleys, we again get a sense, like we did with the faunal remains, of people having come from long distances through these central valleys by the chieftain centers of Gilsbaki and Reykholt, up through the interior, past another chieftain center called Kalmanstunga, and up to Surtshellir. Again, this sense of procession, of people moving, potentially even farther with these other ones here. So we're using the fire starters to get a sense of movement from the outside into the cave. Where are people coming from? And not just from the local area, they're coming from great distances. We also are using it to look at the movement of people inside. And here, just in all of those little ovals at the bottom, those are individual groups of fire starters that we can identify are connected by their geochemistry that came from different geological sources. And you can get a sense here that while there are a few fire starters, starter fragments that show that fires were started in the vestibule and right at the mouth, at the entrance of the structure, almost all of them are deposited as people are making fires and striking fires in a U-shaped structure around that area where the fires were made. And that all of this implies that when you are standing there, the area where that gable is against the lava wall is the focus of your activity. The two niches behind are behind you. This may be where things were stored, but it could also be where images of different mythic personages were placed. We don't know. But the activity is focused from that area where the animal remains were burnt, where the fires were forced, towards that niche against the wall that actually connects the living lava to this space where activity was taking place. Question from all of this, one question is, how many times were fires made here? Well, the experimental work we've done on making fires and how many spalls fall off, and also from places like that little area in the vestibule I showed you, shows that on average you get about 4 to 5 spalls before you can strike a fire once you know how to do it pretty well. With more than 320 spalls, this could suggest 60 to 80 separate fire starting events, which may imply once a year, given that we also know from the radiocarbon dates that we're looking at probably a 60 to 90 year or 80 to 90 year period. So we're beginning to get a sense from this that we may be looking at the remains of annual events that take place at the end of the winter and the spring, in which fires are raised in the darkness, in the space, animal remains are burned, their ashes are thrown into the cave. Also, unburned remains are left in 7 piles across the interior, and the 7 piles have radiocarbon dates that make them all consistent. In addition to the fire starter fragments and the bones, there is an assemblage which is the second largest assemblage of glass beads from a non-burial site in all of Iceland. There are about 63 of these beads, and they're again all in the center, and they're largely focused just inside that southern exit to the building. They include plant ash beads of blown glass that came from as far away as Baghdad or Constantinople, wound glass beads from the same area, wood ash beads that were just at that point beginning to be made for the first time in Central Europe in areas that would be Moravia, Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic at the moment, and a series of different kinds of wound glass beads, which are made from natron beads. This is probably from recycling Roman glass, as was done throughout the Viking Age, recycling it into glass, and they come from South Scandinavia, including many, many, many of these tiny beads that you see here at the bottom. What's important about this is not just where they came from, but also the colors that are used. Typically, anywhere you look at Viking Age bead assemblages from Iceland, they are random and wide range, 8, 10, 15 different types and very different kinds. Here, the vast majority of the beads are green, then yellow, blue, and a couple of brown. It's a very clear and a very obvious intentional selection of bead colors, probably from one object, we suspect. We don't know what that object would have been. And although we don't know much about the color symbolism of the deities associated with the deities in Viking Age Scandinavia, very standard color interpretations uses of these colors would be blue for the sky, green for vegetation, the growing world, yellow for the sun, brown potentially for the earth itself. All of the things which would relate to fertility, which would relate to the growth of crops, to the growth and prosperity. It seems possible that these colors reflect a linkage to the god Frey. We can't be certain about that, but given that Freyr is the god who will fight against Surtur at Ragnarök, it may suggest that the activity that's going on here is less about propitiating Surtur to keep him from coming out of the cave and starting the eruption again, or bringing on the end of the world, and more with strengthening the god Frey in here through sacrifices of his children, the animals, domestic animals, in order to strengthen him against Surtur and to hold back the end of time. In addition to this, in the floor, in association for the most part with the beads, we found 12 tiny fragments of this goldish material, which originally we thought was fool's gold. We thought might be gold foil. We even thought, because of its folded nature, that it could be foil from beer bottles. When it was analyzed, it turns out to be an arsenic sulfide called orpiment, which was a material that was used in the Middle Ages from the 7th century onward into the 13th century for the production of the brightest gold and yellow pigments that were used in Northern Europe in the Middle Ages. This does not exist naturally in Iceland. These are tiny fragments, basically ground up to create a reflective surface on some object. It doesn't exist in Iceland, and the places where it was found in the Middle Ages are on the borderlands of Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, more than 5,000 kilometers away. And the places where it was used in the Viking Age, there are 4 locations we know of so far. One is Surtsettler. One are the furniture that was produced and buried in the tomb of Gorm the Old, the king of Denmark, around 950 AD. The shields and the steering arm of the Gokstad ship burial, possibly a queen's burial from Norway, has orpiment on it, and a fragment of a Viking ship that was found in Dublin also has it. So this is material that is used both before and after the Viking Age, and during the Viking Age, only in association with the most elite contexts and in settings which relate to religion, ritual, and association with divinity, whether in the Christian form or in the past. It is again, if we had not screened everything through 1.5 millimeter mesh, we would never have seen these. These are only a few millimeters across, and they're incredibly toxic. So when we put these things together to talk about movement, not just within the cave and not within Iceland, where are the materials coming from? You can see from this map here where the plant ash beads, the orpiment, the light blue beads, the natron beads as recycled Roman glass, the wood ash beads, and the mini beads are coming from vast distances. These tell us that we are being linked into the kinds of networks, trade networks, that are only to be seen with the elite members of Icelandic society, the chieftains and such. And in the case of the orpiment, they're linking into uses of that material in only the highest levels of society in Viking Age society in Scandinavia. It's telling us, rather than outlaws who were in this cave, that this cave was being used, overseen, organized, and recruited for new members over the space of almost 100 years from Iceland's elite class. And the Jasper Firestarter fragments are telling us that they are coming to the space from at least 3 and probably many more parts of Iceland, because we've only been able to associate 40% of those Firestarter fragments with sites within 70 kilometers. If we needed to yet further indication that this is a place which was being frequented and used by elites, we only have to look to this small group of objects. These are 4 lead weights that were found located right on the surface where the fires had been started in the center of the space. We know that these had to be placed there together as a group at the time that the site was closed, because lead melts at approximately 330 degrees centigrade, and the fires that were raised in there, as I say, are at least 600 to 800, maybe 900 degrees Celsius. In other words, had these been placed there when the site was being used, they would have melted, and all we would have found is puddles of lead. The 2 on the left are forms that are typically known in 10th century and early 11th century Scandinavia as weights that are used to weigh out silver. The 2 on the right are a little bit different. The one in the second from the right is a piece of a lead ingot that has been cut and trimmed, and all of these have been pecked with little holes to calibrate them to specific weights. And the one on the right is in the form of what appears to be a Christian cross. Now, what's interesting about these is the weights. If you add them together, they come to 26 grams. And 26 grams is exactly the old öre or öre, which was the 9th to 10th century standard in Norway based on Merovingian coins. This was the ounce that was used in all cases. And it also matches up with the Dublin ounce of 26 grams that was used by the Vikings in Dublin. So this is a North Atlantic weight set. And it differs from the one, but it differs from the ones that were used at the same time that focused on 24 grams and were divided then into 3 8-gram units and then a whole series of smaller units that were used for transactions in trade. The 26-gram unit is an older one, which was retained for some interesting reasons. But what's even more interesting about this is if you take these 4 weights and you put them into combinations, as you see here in the lower right, they exactly divide up the ounce into 10 decimal units. This is unlike anything that would be used in trade in Scandinavia at this time. And there are only 2 places in which the division of the ounce into tenths are known. And they're both from the medieval Icelandic laws in parts that are considered the oldest on compensation for death, injuries, or debts, and also in the chapter in Grágás, the Icelandic law code, about freeing slaves. When you had a slave who was able to buy his freedom, he had to present silver to a chieftain at the assembly in exactly 1/10 of an ounce unit using the old ounce style. And in paying compensation for death, injuries, or debts, you had to provide it according to the ancient legal silver ounce, with 10 pennies making an ounce. In other words, the weight set we have here is not a trader's weight set. This is a set which is meant for weighing out literally the value of human life, and would have been the sort of thing that was only used, even though it's not very attractive, by chieftains. And it implies that this was laid down in the place where fires had been made for almost 100 years, on top of it with a small Christian cross, presumably to seal the site at the time that it was abandoned. And we can see again from the radiocarbon dates that the site is abandoned, that we see no activity after about 1020 to 1030 AD, which is the time of Christianity arriving. And as we play a little bit more with the dates and we begin doing some analyses of them, statistical analysis, we can see here that the range of time over which the site is used is again about 100, 120 years. If we put into here what we're able to identify as being the eruptive phase, when the eruption was actually going on, and then the cooling down phase, it's right after that that we get a peak of activity in the site, the first peak, based on all of the radiocarbon dates, implying that as soon as you could arrive and get into the cave and not cook yourself and be able to do it, this is when we begin to see offerings, because we're actually dating the offerings themselves. We're dating these bones, that the real peak of activity is right as soon as you can get in. It then begins to slide out, but there's consistent activity through the 10th century. A small peak right around 1000 AD, where that little dotted line is, right at the time of conversion, and then right about the time that it was abandoned, another peak. And we see the same thing at another ritual site in Iceland called Hofstadr in the north, suggesting that sacrifices continued here as Christianity was taking over in Iceland as a process rather than an event. And as a result, this became intensified as you got to the point where you knew you could no longer make these sacrifices inside. And again, here is that little cross showing the pecking on the outside, which, based on our radiocarbon dates, is probably the earliest Christian icon known in the North Atlantic. So pulling all of this together, what does it tell us? It tells us that there was a catastrophic event, an existentially mind-blowing event of a volcanic eruption, which began and probably lasted, from what we can tell, for 20 and possibly 30 years, coming down from the interior into the areas that were newly settled and threatening to destroy the new settlement and move and to continue for an unknown period of time. Remember, these people had never seen volcanic eruptions again. If they had volcanic eruptions going on in their neighborhood for almost a generation, the idea that it might just be continuous would have been of considerable interest. We know now that when the eruption here ended and things cooled down well enough to get into the interior. This cave had been found. It was probably seen by breath apparently coming out of the outside of it. Thorvaldr Holbarki's story suggests that you had chieftains coming from as far as 150 kilometers away in order to proclaim, to do chants, to do spells into the interior. And from both the faunal remains and from the fire starters, we have comparable evidence of people moving over long distances to come up into the cave, and suggestions based on the number of fire starter fragments that this was probably happening on a regular basis, probably annually, and from the faunal remains, it was happening at the end of spring, at the end of winter, rather, the beginning of spring. So we're looking at probably a seasonal sacrificial event that was taking place for 100 years on an almost annual basis. As I showed before, we wind up having a sequence that we can see it would require bringing together animals from a district, moving them up into the interior, slaughtering them, and then dividing their parts in different ways so that they could be, in some cases, consumed, presumably through feasting, or left to rot on the outside of the cave, to bring in ravens, to bring in other birds of prey, which seems to be a standard aspect of Norse mythic practice, as you see, or ritual practice, as you hear in other places. Think about the description of the temple in Uppsala, where all of the bodies of animals were left to hang on the trees so that birds of prey and ravens and others would come down from the heavens and consume them, while other parts of animals were brought into the cave and distributed there through the interior. Looking at the cave itself, we wind up, again, being able to think of it now being divided into a series of different zones, a public zone on the outside, where there might have been, the animals might have been slaughtered, and there was probably feasting, knowing what we know about other descriptions of Norse ritual. There is a zone between the entrance and that massive wall, which we might consider a liminal zone, where light disappears as you go farther into it until you're in total darkness. It's a zone where clearly materials were mobilized, where some number of people were able to come to build that wall, which is not something that could have been built by just a couple of people. An area of collective action, but in the dark, in a space which was already separated, and probably would require a certain amount of communal or coordinated activity, but maybe only of a small group. Beyond the wall, there appears to be a restricted zone where you would see movement of materials through this area. And with the wall separating the exterior and the interior, we could imagine probably a smaller group of people. Yet another zone of separation where you have to know where to rise, to go up 5.5 meters and the vertical sides of the cliff into these side walls. And then beyond that, an offering zone that we can see going 120 meters across the interior of the cave, where it was probably the most sacred activities and the most limited personnel, with these bone piles potentially forming, like the little structure in Vigasetler, forming quite likely an activated, ritually empowered barrier between the interior of the cave and the exterior. And the interior of the cave, as we've surveyed down through it, there's no evidence of anyone going in there in the Viking Age. So it looks as though we have a very intense structure created here, or a system, a site, which is meant to block off activity from the interior of the earth towards the exterior. We know that it's identified in, at least by the 12th century, with the name of the being Surtur. And again, here is just a general sense that you've got a very organized structure in the inside with bones and fuel cached for the future on the one side, burnt offerings in the center, bones piled to rot out the outside of it, and ashes thrown into the interior. And then, as I say, again, this whole sequence of bones, of bone piles, with a wall of bone piles and a physical wall separating this interior zone from both the interior of the earth and the exterior world of humans. For me, as I look forward on trying to think about this site, there are three outstanding questions I'm still trying to work on. One is, if Surtur was potentially so significant, why isn't it mentioned in the sagas or other medieval sources? Second, if Icelanders' initial experiences with volcanism led them to conduct rituals and sacrifices inside the site after the eruption ended, is there any evidence to suggest what they did while it was ongoing? And finally, at what point did Viking Age Icelanders begin to accept volcanic activity as part of the natural order and adapt to it rather than seeking divine intervention? In the first case, is it the truth that it isn't mentioned in the sagas or other medieval sources? One place where it maybe is in a poem called the Hallmundarkviða, which is in a small story called Bergbúaþáttur. Bergbúaþáttur is written in the 13th century, and it tells a story of a farmer and his assistant who get trapped in a cave and hear a 12-stanza poem recited 3 times over the course of the night by a giant who lives deep inside the cave. The poem is thought, based on its language, to be from the 10th century. And it's been translated a number of times. It's very difficult to translate. And parts of it seem very hard to understand until you realize that there actually is a site inside Surtshellir. Because in parts of it, and I've just given part of a recent translation here by Taryn Wills from 2022, one part of it says, "We were all gathered together in a world of darkness so that the cave was sufficient. And I sent Oirnir, a strong, iron-adorned stone boat." This is a poem being told in theory by one of the giants who has started a whole series of volcanic eruptions. And at some point, as people gather together in the cave, it mentions that the god Thor is coming towards them, striding across the mountains. The group who is now talking about it says we were all together in this world of darkness, so that the cave was sufficient. And it was hot in there, and they did things, and there was a battle between the giants and Thor. The eagle's wives' hopes, which maybe if eagles are representing, as they do in a lot of areas here, chieftains, that the wishes of these chieftains' wives were granted, presumably victory. They carried the giants away, and part of that was to build a stone boat down inside the cave. And we have a stone boat inside this cave. The giants who have started the eruption, then according to the last stanza, Thor and the other gods have come in, they've caused injury. They say there's only one evil, that there's only evil for us, based that he creates the evil, Thor. The one who sets fires to glaciers, this fire giant, is dead, and all of the giants are diminished, and this giant who's speaking the poem goes down into Surtur's realm, into the hot flame, into the hot fire. So this may not be the poem that Thorvald Hallbarki proclaimed, but if it is 10th century, it seems to be referencing the kinds of things that go on in Surtshellir. There may be other sites like this in Iceland, but we've not seen them yet. It's the only one that seems to be in a cave with a stone boat. There are other cases in Landnámabók where it talks about people's responses to volcanic activity, and they involve magic and they involve ritual as well. So the sense that sometimes is said that volcanoes, even though being present, are vanished in Norse literature, Icelandic literature, I don't think is actually true. To think about what was going on before the rituals began in Surtshellir, is there any way to think about it? I'm just beginning to worry about that, to think about it. And one of the things is to realize is that the 10th century in Iceland was a volcanically active period, incredibly volcanically active. The first one of those that came up is Surtshellir, but you can see there's a whole series of volcanic eruptions that take place over the course of the 10th century. One of the most unusual things about Iceland, if any of you have ever been there, you read the sagas, compared to other parts of Scandinavia, is how many people have the name Thor in some way. Thorvard, Thorgerður, male and female. And places are named for Thor. Thor being the being who normally would be fighting giants. And if you begin to look at the names in Landnámabók and look at them generation by generation, starting with the names of people in Norway before they came to Iceland, where there's only 17 to 20, maybe 25% of the people, but a low percentage who had any names for Thor. By the middle of the 10th century, the names with Thor in them, according to Landnámabók, double until almost 1 out of every 3 people in Iceland is named for Thor. And there are cases in Landnámabók where it talks about land being dedicated to Thor and given Thor's name, temples being dedicated to Thor, given Thor's name. It may be that what we're seeing here is indications that over these first 2 generations, as one began to deal with the existential threat of volcanism, that dedicating children by their names to Thor was also an important part of what was going on. having at least someone in your family who's part of that. And on the right-hand side, you can see that when you compare the number of names, that the increase and change in the number of names with Thor in them over time is rapid increase through the 10th century, whereas names that are linked to the various names of Odin, who has many more pseudonyms that could have been used as personal names, it's almost a flat line. There's something very clearly going on with Thor here. And in terms of when did they begin to naturalize the sense of volcanoes being important and natural features rather than things that had to be dealt with? Well, we know that Surtsettler there were sacrifices being made there for 100 years, right up until Christianity came in. And I think the punchline of that is that even though they continued making eruptions in there or sacrifices in there for almost 80 years after the eruption ended. So from a very straightforward perspective, what they did there worked. That volcano never erupted again. There were many others in other parts of Iceland that erupted, and there's indications in Landnámabók about the ways that they were dealt with. People moved. People became friends with giants. People did various things. But by 1000 AD, that is to say about 100 years after the eruption ended in the Hotmundarhraun, when Icelanders adopted Christianity itself, the idea of the conversion, was debated in terms of metaphors of volcanism. The story goes in Kristni Saga that as the two factions of the heathens, the followers of the Old Norse religion, and the Christians had drawn up arms, and civil war was about to begin at the Althing, the National Assembly, in 1000 AD, over the issue of whether Iceland should convert to Christianity or keep its old gods. A person came running in from an area about 60 kilometers away to tell one of the chieftains that his house was about to be destroyed by a volcanic eruption. The leaders of the faction that didn't want to convert to Christianity looked at this and said, "You can see the gods are angry at us for even thinking about this." The leader of the Christian faction instead pointed to the ground beneath their feet, where the lava was coiled and ropey, and he said, "If that's so, who were the gods angry with when this lava flowed?" So over the course of 100 years, they had gone from facing the existential threat of volcanic activity by using their existing practices of sacrifice, ritual, procession, movement, poetry, words, actions, to try to hold off the end of the earth, to hold off the end of the world. And they had gone from that to a sense that you could now talk about the ways in which a change in religion could also be matched by a change in the understanding of volcanic activity itself and its naturalization as something that happened and that you knew you could move away from, rather than being the sign that this was the beginning of the end of the world. So to conclude, Icelanders' first experiences with volcanism caused an existential crisis, and it appears that efforts were undertaken to control the uncontrollable, and these included ritual activities, sacrifices in Surtsettler, and quite possibly the dedication of individuals to the gods who could fight against these. The evidence from inside the cave implies that these rituals were undertaken by Iceland's emerging elites. Remember, this is a time when there was no guarantee there would be an Iceland. There could have been many different polities, but people came together. So this implies that there was collaborative involvement of elite people from considerable different distances, and the sacrifices inside Surtsettler continued long after the eruption ended, and it never started up again, meaning that it could well have been seen that the ritual actions of these elites were seemingly effective and may have helped them to formalize power in Iceland at a time, even at the beginning of Iceland, when again there was debate about whether Iceland was going to be governmentally in the hands of both Christians and non-Christians, or only those who followed the old gods. And it came out to be only the old gods, just at about the point that this site and others began to be heavily used. There's also good reason to think that Icelanders' first experiences of volcanism appears to have promoted the idea of Surtur as a creator and destroyer. And there's no prior evidence of references to Surtur in Scandinavia. There are no representations of him anywhere or any place names linked to him outside of Iceland. this suggests that Bertha Philpotts may have been right, that our understanding of Ragnarok ending in flames and conflagration and the destruction of the world in fire and presumably lava may actually be Icelandic specific rather than something that was pan-Scandinavian. And by a century later, as I said, Icelanders had moved through this and were able 3 generations afterwards to debate the conversion in volcanic metaphors, having naturalized, if not tamed, the volcanoes in their midst. I want to thank the people who provide us with funding for this project and my crew members, and also the landowners of the site and the agencies in Iceland that present. I wanted to thank all of you too for listening to what I know has gone on longer than I thought, but it is an interesting site, and I hope you enjoyed it. And in the meanwhile, who knows how the world will really end. Thank you so much.
I don't know how to proceed from here, because it was mind-blowing. We have a couple of questions, but actually we have only 20 minutes.
We'll try to do what we can.
Okay. One of my questions, you actually started to answer when we were on backstage before the presentation.
Oh, okay.
But we are going to a couple of questions, one from Johnny, one from Luciana, and if we have time, we keep going. Okay, that's okay for you. All right. So Johnny asked the concept of Vulcan. Can you read the question? I
can only read the first 2 lines.
Yes. Okay, it's because the StreamYard break the questions into different. Okay, so Johnny asks, the concept of volcanism linked to Ragnarok has been applied to 3 key moments: the events of the 6th century, one, the rock runestone, and Viking Age Iceland. Is it possible to identify a connection or continuity between these 3 instances? And if so, how do they relate to one another in terms of cultural or mythological interpretation?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Johnny. The argument about the 6th century, 5th, 6th century, 6th century linkages to volcanism is in the argument that the Fimbulvetur, that 3-year period of freezing, of continual winter, effectively, that is at the start of Ragnarok in the medieval Icelandic conception of it, is relating to a 3-year period that's seen in a number of different indicators of stunted growth and cold in much of the world around 536, 538 AD, if I remember the dates correctly. Neil Price has argued this. There have been a number of others who've argued it. A paper just came out recently that is arguing it. It's kind of compelling, the idea that it was that this period of cold may have, in similar ways to what I think is happening with the eruption in Iceland, creating a context for understanding and creating metaphors about the end of the world and when do things become awful. 3 years of perpetual winter means famine, and as a result, it leads to chaos and all of that. It's linked to volcanism only, though, because the volcanoes in question are thought to be in Central America or North America. So it's nothing that would have been seen or experienced as a volcanic event in Scandinavia. We see from a scientific perspective that it is something that is probably ultimately caused by volcanism, assuming that you can really pin down the changes in Scandinavia that close to the ways that they can pin these things down. We see changes in the ways rituals taking place, sacrifices are taking place, settlements are taking place around that time, but often based on radiocarbon dates that could have begun before those eruptions, could have begun after those eruptions. It's hard to tell. There's a link to volcanism there, but it's not a link that would have been seen in Scandinavia. What would have been seen in Scandinavia is 3 years of terrible winters and starvation. The rock runestone, I don't want to talk too much about because I'm not entirely convinced it relates to volcanism, but that's a study for a different time. The case in Iceland, I feel is very strongly made, and it's also been made by Clive Oppenheimer and such who've looked at the eruptions of the Eldgjá eruption in 939 to about 943. The dating keeps going back and forth as one of the largest, if not the largest, flood basalt eruption in historic times. It was certainly in this period of time. He argues that that was what led to Christianity becoming something that was adopted at the all thing, that basically the inability of the whatever was going on in Iceland to stop these volcanic eruptions weakened the power of belief in the gods and allowed them to think about something else. That may be the case. It's saying that 60 years after that eruption ended is when Christianity came in. But maybe people were beginning to lose faith beforehand. I think what we're seeing is that there were quite a number of eruptions in the 10th century, including this one, which was the first one that we think people had seen. And I would say from the beginning, I think this probably strengthened the power of belief in the gods, at least initially. But it's quite possible that the continued eruptions over the space of the 10th century, which seems to have been geologically more active than centuries that came right after them, may indeed have made people question their faith. I think what made them question their faith even more, though, was the inability of Iceland's elites by 1000 AD to be able to trade in Scandinavia for the goods that they needed to support their lifestyle. By 1000 AD across most of Europe, if you hadn't converted to Christianity, you couldn't trade in the ports. And people had gotten quite used to Viking raids, so they knew how to repel them, and they had bigger walls. And by 1000 AD, if you were a Viking chieftain in Iceland, you had to give your supporters swords. You had to give them fancy textiles. You had to give them all kinds of things that came from the outside. I suspect it was more the problem of being unable to connect with Europe that led them to say, well, yeah, the hell with it. Let's become Christians. Hell was ours to begin with anyway, so we get it. So I think the volcanic activity, to answer Johnny's question in a hopefully productive way, is there are connections between them, but they are analytical on the one hand with Fimbulvetr, probably direct with regard to Surtsettler with the rock runestone, depending on its dates and what it's really saying. I think that's something more to be thought about. And in terms of the question of the conversion, I think it probably has something to do with it. But in Landnámabók also, by the time it talks about, it clearly is referencing the Eldgjá eruption, because somebody has taken land there and the eruption takes place and covers that zone, and they move someplace else where they become friends with giants who make them rich. So, it's a much more complicated story to the extent we can trust a 13th century, 12th, 13th century story of past stories as a guide to what people did. Does that help?
Wow. Yes, I believe so. Yes.
Okay.
I have to give one quick notice in Portuguese, and we'll go back to the questions. Pessoal, quem estiver assistindo a apresentação, saibam que o mini curso da professora Luciana, eu vou repetir no final, mas o mini curso da professora Luciana, as inscrições estão abertas até o início do curso, tá? Então, se você não se inscreveu, corra. So, back to the questions.
Sure.
Luciana she made one question about the tapestry, I believe. Yes. To what extent did the phenomenon of volcanism in medieval Iceland inspire contemporary narratives or poetry? Is there evidence of its influence in tapestries or other forms of visual art from that period?
To answer the latter question first, no. We don't have. We basically, Michelle Hayers-Smith, who's done most of the work on the textiles from Iceland, would probably immediately say there are virtually no tapestries from Iceland of that time period, and the textiles of that period are really interesting and diverse, but we don't have that kind of figurative art. with regard to the poetry, well, as I said, the story of Thorvaldr Holbarki, who is in Landnámabók, again, I hate to go back to that source, but these are what we have, and poetry doesn't preserve well archaeologically. So that story implies that he came across the interior of Iceland specifically to sing a poem of praise, to sing a drapa into the cave, into the mouth of the cave, and he had composed it. And when he composes it, and he goes to the cave, he then goes off to another farm where he knows people. He gets married, and is able to start his own chiefly line. So it's again one of these signs of chaos, of disruption, an act of poetry that leads to a restoration and then his ability to socially reproduce the system and move forward. To the extent that poem actually existed, and certainly, 300 years later or 250 years later, when Landnámabók was written down, people seem to remember a story that this had been done. That it implies that poetry had been involved in this. And the poetry, the poem Hallmundarkviða, which I mentioned there at the end in Bergboðaþáttur, is without a question, it describes in very metaphoric language, but it's clear. The first half of it is all about, it describes the progression of eruptions, of the ground rumbling, of strange forms of mud coming out of the world being destroyed, of clouds and fire and all that sort of thing. And then at the end of it, it describes these sudden changes as people gather together in the dark, and the gods are called, and there's hope then produced, and the giants who had created the eruption are defeated, and the ones who aren't killed go off into the ground, to the realm of Surtur. I am not a complete student of Old Norse poetry by any means. So I have to rely on those who have studied it, and they feel that the language and the way it's constructed is probably 10th century or early 11th century. So probably contemporary, although it's in a 13th century story that isn't about that exact same thing. So to answer Luciana's question, we know of those two examples. It's not clear that there's any others that we know about, but that's better than none.
Ok. André, procura depois no chat para ver se a gente ainda tem questões do público. Because I have some questions. Unfortunately, my big first question, you already smashed it down during your presentation.
Sorry about that.
But there are bits that it would be awesome if you could go through it. Because years ago, when I was a student during my bachelor, I read a book from Jean-Pierre Vernant, which is, of course, a French mythologist. And, of course, this is a very, very, very different context, temporal and cultural context, because he was writing about the Greek offerings called holocaustos, which is an offering to appease underworld figures like Hecate and Ceres and even the Gorgons. So you go to cave, and you go through darkness, and you burn the offerings. You don't consume the offerings. These offerings must be only for these spirits.
Right.
And of course, when I first read your article about outlaws living in the cave, which is right now you have a very different position.
Yes.
It was impossible for me to not think about the same connections.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I need to ask is this work that you have been doing, Surtus Hitler. I believe this is a very, very challenging archaeological site, because lots of people went there and took bones and everything. But do you believe that we have enough archaeological material to say that, yes, we have these cult or ritual linked to Surtur, or when people went to dark and with torches or not, but they went to this place where they burned the meat to appease Surtur, or not Surtur, but to call a figure like Freyr to empower him and protect them from Surtur. Do you believe that these figures are disconnected to this ritual?
So that's a really good question. Thanks for asking. It's a complicated one. It's one that we wrestle with all the time, because again, we can't hear the words that were said at the time, and we only have what we have. I think it's obvious, given that there's no other place on Earth except a couple of, the island Surtsey, which came out of the Atlantic in 1964 and was named at that point. This is the only place which is named for Surtur. And it was, so it seems clear to me that that this name is not just thrown around willy-nilly. It meant something, like most Icelandic place names meant something. When somebody says it's Thorvardstaðir, usually it's meant to think that this is where Thorvard, the story is that that's where a guy named Thorvard settled. So Surtshellir does make me think that this is supposed to be the place that Surtur was known. And in fact, as late as 1815, when the
Hetlismanna saga.
Well, yeah, not that one, actually. It's but Hetlismanna saga from the 19th century, that's where a local man, a Western Icelandic man in Western Iceland, pulled together a whole bunch of sources to try to create a coherent saga. There's an earlier Hetlismanna saga, which is the one that tells about the young priests who became evil. That one's known at least from the 1700s. But in the 1700s, 1750, when Egger Olafsson and Bjarni Pálsson were at Kalmanstunga and they got taken out to Surtshellir, they got told that story about the young priests who had become evil, but they were also still told in the 18th century that this is a place where Surtur had lived, and also that there were ghosts and spirits in the cave that would trap you and keep you around. As late as
I see where this is going. Yeah.
As late as 1815, a young American missionary, or a young Christian guy who went up to Iceland, was told at that point that people believed that Surtshellir was where Satan would emerge at Judgment Day. So there's still this sense of somebody inside there that was important, that you didn't want coming out. So I think the name implies that the cave was linked to Surtur. I think the fact that we've got both textual and archaeological evidence of ritual going on in the cave, whether it's singing poems of poetry into the mouth of the cave to the being who lives there, or doing things inside, implies that this is all linked together. Is it a cult of Surtur, or is it activity to propitiate him, or acts that are meant to bind him and prevent him from coming out? That's the harder question, right? I think the fact that we've got these lines of bones that seem to be linked to the ritual practice that create almost a wall of what would have been ritually charged material across the interior looks to me like a barrier that's meant to prevent something from coming out. The fact that the beads there are all linked to colors that you could connect to fertility is interesting, but we can't say much about that because we just don't know much about Viking Age color symbolism. I wish we did. As archaeologists and as medievalists, we ignore color, and yet that's the first thing anyone sees. We do a stupid job when it comes down to it. We study the chemical composition of something and forget what it actually is. The other side of it is, too, that I think it is important that given all these fires were started inside the cave, and the closest material available for doing it is black obsidian, which is literally found 3 to 5 kilometers outside the cave as you walk towards it. And that's avoided. I think there's one tiny fragment less than a millimeter across in 350 fragments of different colored materials. That's telling me avoidance, because the obvious thing to use if all you were doing was starting fires is that. So if I had to put my money on it, I would put my money on the idea that this is meant to be a sacrifice of animals that are related to Freyr and are probably meant to strengthen him and to ward off the cave to hold something back. I mean, I don't want to say it's exactly the Temple of Doom, but ultimately, if it is about sort of forestalling the end of the world, if this initial eruption was seen as something that continued for a generation and other volcanoes came up, and if it was locally seen, and I think it's really important to remember that potentially everything we're seeing in the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda about the end of the world may just be what we would consider traditional ecological knowledge, TEK of Icelanders, rather than others in other parts of Scandinavia. This may be all about them talking about the end of the world and the way they see it, and the ways in which they've visualized it and found ways to try to put it against it. There may have been a being called Surtur in Norse mythology elsewhere who probably may not have had the same level of importance, or may have had importance with fire. But here, the fire came from the earth and continued. Yeah, so I think that's a roundabout way of answering your question, or not answering it, but
it does.
But I think it's hard to say which of the two. But I don't see any way in which this is easily related to any other beings except the possibility of Thor. And one could argue that little cross is also kind of hammer-like. Like a lot of early Icelandic and early Scandinavian crosses also have a hammer-like effect. I think it's probably a Christian cross, but especially given when it had to be put there. But I don't know.
No, it does. It totally does answer my question. Thank you, Kevin. I had other questions about Jasper and about Bishop Thorlakur sanctioning Okai mutilation inside Sutzhetler, but we are absolutely out of time right now.
Okay, all right.
So, Kevin, on behalf of every member from Neve, we thank you by your time and your attention to our conference. Thank you. E todo mundo que ficou até aqui, a gente ainda tem atividade, tá? E novamente, quem não se inscreveu ainda no curso da professora Luciana de Campos, o faça, vale muito a pena. And that's it.
Thank you very much,
Professor, and thank you everybody who stays till now with us. Thank you.